Let's take a look at the state of NBA free agency, at what it means for two Pacers free agents, James Johnson and George Hill, plus Pacers Summer League Game 4 breakdown, their worst game yet, and lessons the Pacers can learn from the Trailblazers and the Damian Lillard era. We'll get to it all today on another weekend edition Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Saturday, everybody. Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where, of course, we talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today it's a weekend, and I didn't think I was going to do a weekend show, but one, I was doing a lot of random research on free agency, what could still happen, and it made me run into a topic on George Hill and James Johnson, and if the Pacers could be involved with them still, or what their outlook could even look like for the rest of free agency. I wanted to talk about it, and I wanted to talk about something that Zach Lowe wrote about Damian Lillard and the Blazers, and how the Pacers need to learn a lesson from that if they don't want to end up in the same situation way down the line, not imminently. And also, the Pacers played a Summer League game last night, so lots to talk about. I figured, why not talk about it? And I will start with the state of free agency, because I found this to be a very interesting discussion. As I'm talking, and as this episode comes out, it's July 15th. We're 2 weeks into free agency, and if you'll recall, Kevin Pritchard said something in his end-of-season presser last year. He was talking about O'Shea Brissett and these two players, James Johnson and George Hill, and he said, those are like July 10th signings. July 10th signings, meaning something you do late in free agency, like Jakar Sampson was an August 1st signing, for example. Basically, that means the guys you complete your roster with, not your big resource guys. And so I was looking today with those two players still unsigned. George Hill won a local award, and that got me really digging into what the options could even be for these two players in the free agency landscape in general. And the Pacers have a full roster right now. They don't have room for either of these guys as it stands, but I was thinking, if the Pacers would make a move and have a chance to get them, would anyone else scoop them up? What would that take? What does the league look like right now? Is there anyone even worth more than the minimum out there? Or because that's what the key part of looking at free agency for James Johnson and George Hill is right now. Like, they're minimum salary players, and so if every player left is a minimum salary player, they're competing for the same resources. If there's better players than them, then obviously they're in a little trickier spot. And there's not that many good free agents left. I think that's one important thing to talk about with the free agent landscape right now. Kelly Oubre is more than a minimum player. Christian Wood, Hamidou Diallo, maybe Kendrick Nunn, I guess. Maybe a few other guys, but maybe Derek Jones Jr. Basically every free agent left, I think, is a minimum guy. Except for the restricted free agents. I would assume Moo and PJ Washington are obviously well over minimum guys. Restricted free agency certainly impacts their market. So everyone else is basically a minimum salary player who's left out on the market. So everybody's looking for the same money and the same roster spots. That said, there's also not a lot of roster spots left, and that's where the rubber hits the road for guys like George Hill and James Johnson, whether that's with the Pacers or not. And the Pacers do not currently have a roster spot, right? They do. Let me be clear. Teams can sign up to 21 guys in the summer, and that's new in the new CBA. That number used to be 20. Obviously, their roster can only be 15 when a season starts, and the Pacers are currently at 15 guaranteed contracts. They could sign another player, but then they have to cut someone, and maybe they could sign a non-guaranteed deal. But anyway, they don't currently have the room for guaranteed money additions unless they're willing to just eat that money at some point in the future. And there are 12 teams total, the Pacers being one of them. They're in the same boat. They currently have at least 15 players under contract with guaranteed contracts, and they'll have to either cut someone with guaranteed money or cut a good player with a non-guaranteed money. And most teams don't want to do that. So that's already over a third of the league that just can't sign James Johnson and George Hill. So they can't go to those teams. There are 6 teams outside of those 12 that are over the tax. They have roster spots, but they're over the luxury tax. And that's important because, they've got a spot for George Hill or James Johnson in theory, but they're not going to be using it on, even if they wanted to sign that guy, the tax penalty of doing so makes it expensive and not worth it. Those teams are Philadelphia, Miami, Golden State, Milwaukee, Boston, and New Orleans. So none of those teams make sense for those guys. They would have to pay them their salary and the tax on top of it. Not worth it. 6 other teams So including the 12, the 6, and the new 6 are up to 24 now. There are 6 other teams that have a roster spot or two, but are close to the tax. In theory, yeah, maybe they could sign George Hill or James Johnson, but are you really going to get closer to the tax to sign that guy? If anything, those teams would like to create more wiggle room from the tax so they have more flexibility to make moves in season if they actually need to. Maybe these teams could if they think they're done or they don't think they'll be trading. Add a veteran. This current list is Minnesota, and I'll add some notes in on these teams if I need to. Minnesota, Cleveland, Portland, Chicago, Charlotte, and a team whose name I accidentally typed over with just the letter E. Good work by me there. Alphabetically, I can't even tell what it is. Either way, there's 6 of those teams. Maybe a younger one like Charlotte could make sense, I guess. But either way, in theory, probably those teams are all out for veterans who would not play for them. That's 24 teams, Pacers included, that are probably not in the business of signing George Hill or James Johnson right now. So I have 6 teams with spots to actually do stuff right this second. They have a roster spot, and they have either resources or enough wiggle room from the tax to actually do something. That's the Dallas Mavericks, the Brooklyn Nets, the Sacramento Kings, the Houston Rockets, the Detroit Pistons, and the Utah Jazz. Dallas and Brooklyn have their MLEs. Sacramento just has minimums. Houston might just have minimums. They've done some weird sign and trade stuff. Detroit just has minimums, and Utah has about $3 million in cap space. Now, obviously, George Hill and James Johnson at this stage of their career are minimum salary players. But to put that all in perspective, looking at their landscapes right now, there's only about 6 teams that actually make sense for them. And we've reached that July 10th date where Kevin Pritchard said, hey, that's about the time that would make sense for them to be transactionally involved. Now, the market has slowed down more than a typical summer with the Harden and Dame stuff and the free agents left out there trying to figure out where the most minutes will be this coming season, but it's hard to say until that's done or until teams are all settled. So it's impossible to totally pinpoint that at this time. For example, looking at the players, like if I'm Kelly Oubre, I want to be on the Dallas Mavericks for sure because I think I can get minutes on the wing on that team, but maybe there's even more minutes post-trade in Philly, or maybe there's more minutes post-trade in LA with the Clippers. And in that case, even if I'm getting less money, I could work my way into more money next year, right? So same kind of idea with Christian Wood or any of the guys I already said. PJ Washington and Io, I would expect to be back with their old teams. I wouldn't guarantee that. But, for those guys that I just named specifically, the guys who are maybe worth more than a minimum, they're probably waiting to see the landscape. And every other player in the league is just waiting on a chance. And that includes James Johnson and George Hill. So there's not just many actual spots left in the league, right? That is kind of near the end of free agency, how this works. It kind of pivots into tradey stuff, and that's kind of where the league is right now, and that's tougher on veterans like James Johnson and George Hill. So if the Pacers get into the business of tradey stuff, to use the trademarked word that I just made up right now, then yeah, maybe if they open a roster spot, they'll turn around and bring in a vet. That would make sense to me, but I don't think they need to do that unless they get awesome assets to do so. Their team looks fairly well balanced and good right now, even though they have, maybe some log gems on their team. Having depth is fine. They have a good team. They have had a good summer. So I would say, as it stands, the last 2 kind of dominoes of Pacers free agency, maybe you could count Kendall Brown as one more, but the last 2 dominoes of Pacers free agency that are undecided, that being George Hill and James Johnson, are probably not going to happen until the rest of minimums fill out or there's actual trades, because there's not a lot of spots for them that make any sense in the league landscape right now. I think a move would have to happen elsewhere, or a team's just going to have to commit and say, this is our team, we're ready to add a vet. And it doesn't seem like a ton of teams are rushing to do that right now, given what the league landscape looks like. So I think that if you have had trouble keeping up with every team outside of the Pacers, is a good refresh on where free agency is, and from a Pacers perspective with their vets from last year, why they're unsigned and maybe won't be signed for a while, if at all, this offseason. We will see where they end up if they make sense with the Pacers, but that would require another move for the franchise. Speaking of the Pacers franchise, they played a basketball game on Friday night, and boy, did it stink. They played the Mavs in Summer League. They had a chance to make the Summer League playoffs with a 7 or more point win. Instead, they lost by 21, their worst performance of Summer League. What went wrong? Who stood out, if anybody? What was good? What was bad? We'll get to all of that in this second segment of today's show here on the weekend. Before we do that, though, want to quickly talk to you guys about FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $2,000. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $2,000 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to hit the first home run in a game, all on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, why not hop on over to the Pacers' opponent tonight, Locked On Mavs. Hear more about Max Prosper doing really good stuff in this game. They have a guy whose nickname is Jelly, which is cool. The Mavs hosts Nick Angstad and Isaac Harris will break down the Mavs Summer League, and they just acquired Grant Williams. That's a pretty good trade for them. What is the Mavs looking like now? Locked On Mavs for more on the Dallas Mavericks. Let's get back to the Pacers, who just got smoked by the Mavs, quite frankly. 112-91 was the final score, and saying the final score first is maybe bad business, but I'm going to start there because, hey, 112 points is a lot to give up in a 40-minute game, especially with the talent of Summer League rosters. Pacers defense was terrible for the final three quarters of this game. It's been really not concerning. It's Summer League. It's been really strange to see it kind of deteriorate. Like at halftime of the first game, their defense looked great. We talked to Rick Carlisle at halftime. He said that's something they're really monitoring. That's something they want to focus on with these young guys. They had a horrible defensive third quarter right after that against the Wizards, but 7 of their first 8 quarters were really good defensively, and some of that was they were scoring better and they were more in the half court. But since they pulled the top guys, hasn't been good, right? They've really struggled to defend these last 2 games. It wasn't as bad against I can't even remember who they played in their third game now. It wasn't as bad in the Thunder game. They still lost that one and gave up about 100, but it wasn't nearly. This was brutal. I mean, Max Prosper, 18 points. He had just a couple easy drives, drove all the way to the basket and scored. AJ Lawson had 24 points. He was 10 for 12 from the field. Easily dribbled to the rim and scored. Jelly Walker, I think his real name is James Jonathan. I can't remember. I should know that. He had 21 points. Same deal. Dribble, drive to the rim. It's strange looking at the Mavs' statistical profile because they made more shots than the Pacers, but they had fewer assists. So the way they were playing was whoever had the ball could just attack off the dribble, get by a Pacers defender, get to the rim, and score. That didn't need to pass that much. And they had 18 free throws, which guess how you get those? You get to the rim. You draw contact, right? So this game specifically featured the worst Pacers defense by a mile. Jarris Walker had this was his worst defensive game. Certainly, he got blown by a few times. Shepard got blown by a few times. Everybody did. No one is off the hook for their defensive performance in this game. And this was the worst one for the Pacers. They scored well enough-ish. I mean, their second half specifically, they had 58 points. That was pretty good. But too little too late after 33 points in the first half in the miserable defense they had. If you wanted a story of the game without laser focusing on any specific player or skill, because regular season is totally different game than Summer League, that's where I would start, is that their defense just looked terrible in a way that you would hope they can correct in their final game as Summer League progresses. And they do have one more. It just got announced legitimately while I was talking. The Pacers' final game will be Sunday at 5:30 against the Pistons. That's pretty fun. And then they'll be done with Summer League. So we'll be talking about that game on Monday's podcast. But their defense was so rough in this game. Their rebounding itself was fine. Like, they had fewer defensive rebounds than the Pistons, but that's because they missed more shots than the Pistons. There were less chances. They really had a similar defensive rebound rate. They just missed more shots. The difference in this game was just that they couldn't force more misses. They did a terrible job keeping the Mavs out of the paint and letting them get to these easy spots, and it was kind of everybody, right? Prosper, like I said, Lawson, Walker, all these guys. Miles Jr. did great for them as well. So that was the concerning parts for the Pacers. And if I want to get into specifics, I would say that this was Jarris Walker's worst Summer League game. In fact, I don't even think it's frankly close. This was definitely his worst game. I thought Caitlin Cooper pointed this out pretty well when she was tweeting during the game. You know, in the game before this against the Thunder, he was doing some of those, like he was attacking off the dribble and running some pick and rolls, and the Thunder were just kind of ducking under, and you know, he could get ahead of steam and kind of get to his space in the lane, and he was moderately effective in those creation moments and had some good moments of upside that made everybody think he was looking good, and I was one of those people. In this game, the Mavs were switching, and their scheme was more about cutting off those pick-and-roll drives. And guess what? Jarace Walker did not look very good. He couldn't get to his spots as much. He was 6 for 21. He only had 2 assists and 2 turnovers. He did not look as strong on the offensive end. 1 for 10 from 3. So he was 5 for 11 from inside the arc. That's still not great, but that's more appropriate. The threes have just been brutal for him all summer league long, but he wasn't as effective defensively either, right? The Prosper drives clearly showed that. So I don't know if it was what was going on, if it was something schematic, if he's running out of gas, but he definitely looked less impactful in this game than he has in any other game. Definitely his worst game of summer league, even with some of those moments of like, ooh, that was still really good. And on the flip side, Ben Shepherd came to life a little bit, which I did not expect to be a part of this, right? I always expect Jarace Walker to be the lead with these, but Ben Shepherd, first half, 3 points. I type in my notes. Uncomfortable early, but he was chopping his feet really well on defense. He's quick. His quick feet on defense still stand out to me every game, even though his defense still definitely needs some work and he's moving around. In the second half, man, did Ben Shepherd find his rhythm. 16 points in the second half for 19 total. He went 7 of 13 for the field, 5 for 10 from deep. When he's able to just like figure out where his spots are within the offense, which he did in the second game too when they played the Magic, he looks really good. And his defensive effectiveness can be solid, even though it's not awesome. So he definitely had some head scratcher moments. He had 3 turnovers and 4 fouls. Like, I don't think he would even say he played a perfect game. He talked on the broadcast about working on his defense throughout Summer League, but this was one of his best games, maybe his number 1 best. For all of Summer League, figuring it out, he kept shooting through it, and he looked pretty good offensively. I'm looking forward to seeing him in the Pacers' final game if he does, in fact, play in that game. But that second half was his best half, certainly, of Summer League, maybe not his best full game, and I think it's good that he stuck with it and found ways to be impactful because basically no one else could, right? Oscar Tshiebwe finally missed shots. He had the funniest stat line ever. 7 rebounds, 1 defensive rebound, but he was 3 for 5 from the field. 2 of his misses, I think he rebounded both of his own misses. He had 7 points and 7 boards. He's gonna have the craziest G League stats ever. Kendall Brown was 5 for 8 from the field and had 6 rebounds, and 2 of them were offensive, but his defense was not as impactful in this game as no one's was. Isaiah Wong, after his best game, came back to earth a little bit. He was 3 for 9 with 3 assists. He was fine doing point guardy stuff. So none of their guys that stood out last game were as good this game, except for Shepherd. He went from low levels of impact to really good, his best half of Summer League. I thought that was pretty important for him, and I'm looking forward. Like, if he has a good last game, I think it'd be fair to say 3 of his 5 games were at least solid. If he has a poor last game, then you go, well, he only had 1 good half in that other game, and he really only had 1 full good game. Like, that would be not the greatest performance and would require a lot more analysis than what I just said, but certainly seeing how he does in the last game, if he could finish strong, will be noteworthy to me. This is going to sound silly because he played 12 minutes and was 2 for 5 and was a minus 18, but Mojave King moves well to me. His form looks good. I just like the way he plays. I like the situations they put him in. I like the way he operates when he has the ball. I like his shot form. I just think he does good stuff. I'm intrigued to see what he'll look like overseas this season. Eli Brooks, who played for the Mad Ants last year, had a good game. Shooting the ball, especially. He hit 2 threes. He had 3 assists. He led second on the team in assists with 3. Their leading assists guy was Robert Woodard II, former NBA guy who I said to keep an eye on in this. In 16 minutes, he had 4 points, 4 assists, 3 boards, and was a +1 in his 16 minutes. He was actually pretty effective. Turns out, former NBA players are pretty good in Summer League. I think he might get a tiny bit more burn in this final game if they stop playing Jarace. We'll see. They didn't play all of their rookies every game last year. We will see what happens in these last ones. All the rest of the bench guys, Lajewski, Thompson, McGee, they did some stuff. Darius McGee hit a 3, which was his thing. In camp, he had 2 assists. His 4 minutes were solid. But in general, not a ton of takeaways for those guys in their limited minutes. I also think the guys with contracts are the guys worth more discussion. And I think Tshiebwe had an game, a little worse than normal, although his offensive glass was great. Walker had his worst game. Brown had a good offensive game, defensive game. Wong took a step back, but Shepherd's second half sort of redeems that crew, the starting crew. We'll see who plays in the final game. Again, we don't know that at this time. They literally just announced when it is and who it's against. Then we're done. So Monday's show will be 3 segments. We're not done here, just to be clear, but one of those segments will be Summer League Game 5 breakdown and kind of tidying up thoughts there. And then we'll do a full Summer League breakdown podcast Tuesday, maybe Wednesday. We'll see this coming week. So lots of fun coming on the Summer Pacers, Jarace Walker, the whole shebang. This was his worst game, though, and I want to dive into it a little more going forward. One more segment here, and Zach Lowe, I'm thanking for this one. He wrote a great article about the Damian Lillard saga in Portland and why he traces this exit back to a trade the Blazers made a long time ago. And I'll explain it all in the final segment and explain why I think it's a cautionary tale for the Pacers as they venture in to their next era. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, about Locked On Women's Basketball All-Star Game tonight. Aaliyah Boston and Kelsey Mitchell from the Fever playing. 3-point contest, skills contest last night. Fun stuff at All-Star Weekend for the WNBA. And Locked On Women's Basketball has the latest in women's basketball, and I'm on there every so often talking Fever. Let's talk about this piece by Zach Lowe, and specifically some of the stuff that I want to talk about. This piece is about kind of the slow burn of the Blazers to get to where they are now. And they did some good stuff along the way, but Zach Lowe has some key takeaways about this era and how it got to this point. And so he starts, so the title of this piece is why the Damian Lillard Blazers breakup actually began 8 years ago, a long time. And it starts with this trade that happened in 2015. The Blazers got Aaron Aflalo at the trade deadline for Will Barton and a lottery protected first. I promise I'll tie this into the Pacers, and I'll jump the gun a little bit and explain the connection. Like, they've had Dame for a long time, right? They've had a long time to build around him. And they've made a lot of good moves along the way, but the thesis should be that that's not always enough, and there's something the Blazers didn't do that the Pacers need to do in their 6 years now, at least, that Tyrese Haliburton's under contract, and learn this lesson from the Blazers with Dame. So they were 36-17 in this 2015 season when they made the trade I just described. Will Barton, lotto protected first for Aaron Aflalo. Good trade. They were a good team. And then 2 weeks later, Wes Matthews tears his ACL. And then LaMarcus Aldridge leaves in free agency, which sucks, but that's a good trade. That's a good value trade. Soon after, they get Gerald Henderson in the 9th pick in the draft for Nick Batum. Good trade, good value. Not long after that, they trade Rondé Hollis-Jefferson, an draft pick for Mason Plumlee, their starting center. Good trade. And then not long after that, they trade Mason Plumlee in a 2nd for Yusuf Nurkic and a 1st, right? This is all good, smart business trades, right? These are good deals. They're adding asset value to your team. You're getting talent onto your roster and improving it incrementally. That's good. The Pacers are excellent at this. I give them a lot of credit for the way that they're able to manage their assets, get a lot out of them, continue to do the juggling that the Blazers have done, turn this thing into something slightly better and more palatable for you, and then turn that into something slightly better, and then turn that, you keep doing that forever. That's great. And Zach Lowe talks about that, but he also says, this is right after talking about the Aflalo trade, he says, it was the sort of small trade that would come to define the next 8 years. Smart, but not enough to catch the big boys, or in later years, address the structural limitations of a team constructed around 2 small guards, Lillard and McCollum. I don't think Haliburton's a small guard, so that part doesn't apply as much to the Pacers. But I think the smart but smaller moves part is something to note for the Pacers, who, and look, they're in year whatever you want to say, 1.5 of a rebuild. They don't need to be rushing anything. They don't need to be taking a big swing right now. But I think that's an important lesson to note is, at some point, if you want to be a contender and build around these stars in the league, you're going to have to take a big swing at some point. The Kevin Pritchard front office, and contextually, they have made a lot of the right moves at the right times. Again, I'm higher on their front office than basically every fan. But, they haven't made like a huge send picks out acquisition, right? They've made huge acquisitions. The Paul George trade, they got Victor Oladipo and Sabonis, huge acquisitions. Getting Tyrese Haliburton, huge acquisitions. Those are big, significant, ballsy trades. But they haven't done like the 3 firsts for a star kind of trade yet. The most firsts they've sent on a trade is 1, and that was the Malcolm Brogdon trade. So I'm not saying they should do that now, but I'm saying at some point going forward, if they really want to ascend to contender status, they're going to have to consider that. And this is not a criticism of everything they have done or are going to do. This is just a cautionary tale they can learn from in Portland of these small, smart moves can be so solid for so long and get you some good stuff along the way. But if it's never like the big grand move, it doesn't do as much. And lo and behold, their big grand move was actually part of their problem. The CJ McCollum trade to the Blazers netted them among other things, Josh Hart, a mediocre pick, and some other stuff. And they ended up trading Josh Hart for a pick that became Chris Murray, and some of that other stuff just was kind of blah. And so they basically had a trickle-down assets of CJ McCollum down to Chris Murray. Like, that can't work if you're trying to build and keep Damian Lillard. You have to be more proactive than that. There's more to it, too. And this is part of it that the Blazers had an issue with that the Pacers literally can't have a problem with. That was the 2016 summer when the cap spiked significantly and everybody spent crazy money. And the Blazers did not do well that summer. They signed Alan Crabb. Well, they matched an offer sheet on Alan Crabb. They signed Myers Leonard. They signed Mo Harkless to big contracts. That's not possible, right? The new NBA CBA has literally said, no, we're not allowing that. 10% is the most the cap can increase in a year. Soon after, they traded picks 15 and 20 in the draft for pick 10. They got Zach Collins. Like, that was good, but not great. They traded some assets for Norm Powell and Robert Covington after this. And this is after they made the Western Conference Finals. So even if these small moves don't sound like much, like they probably thought they were a little farther along, but none of those are just the massive moves. And they traded Gary Trent Jr., a guy they picked in the first round, and 2 firsts for Covington. Trent was for Powell. So, like, again, these are a lot of assets going out without, like, this ginormous aggressive trade. Not to say they needed to, and it's not even to say that the right one was available to them. Without knowing what they had on the table, it's not fair to be critical, but we're talking about an 8 to 9 year period here. The lesson could be being bolder or chasing some of those bigger wings along the way is maybe something the Blazers should have considered heavily, and Zach Lowe argues that well. Talks about Paul George, Jimmy Butler, Kawhi Leonard, all these wings that did at one point become available in their path that maybe didn't make sense for them at the time, but maybe would have been something they should have actually considered. In fact, the exact paragraph he wrote was, should they have been bolder chasing big wings who came onto the trade market with minimal time left on their contracts, such as Paul George, Jimmy Butler, or Kawhi Leonard? Leonard and Butler changed teams before and during the 2018-19 season and became defining figures of those playoffs, with Leonard's Toronto Raptors winning the title. Both moved again that offseason, leaving their former teams with little to nothing in return. If you're the Blazers and you get little to nothing in return, that's bad. But that's part of it. Should they have considered that along the way? They had Dame for forever. Like, they didn't make missteps. Having a star for that long in that market is fantastic. It's just something the Pacers need to consider going forward, is they might have to, at some point, just make a big, aggressive move. And I like Zach's kind of, this isn't his full conclusion, but it's close to it. Not a conclusion. This isn't, whatever. You'll see what I'm saying in a second. He says, but openness and creativity unlock more possibilities. The Blazers didn't operate with enough of those traits. There were good and real reasons behind their caution, and they hit on several smaller decisions, but they didn't hit enough, and none of them really changed their team. Trading what could be a low first-round pick last summer for Jeremy Grant, another good, valuable proposition, proved too little, too late. So, the cautionary tale for the Pacers, who, if they wanted to look on this and go, what can we do to not end up in that situation in 8 years, is you can make all these smart, awesome moves along the way that slowly build up your team and are smart, and they're trades that cap lords like me will go, yeah, that's a good trade, good job, good value, that's going to make the team better, that's awesome. At some point, when you know you're good and you know Halliburton's ready to be the dude, you got to, at some point, do something bigger. That time is not now. I don't think the Pacers should do that now. I think they know that. Maybe it's now if it's the right player, obviously, for the right price. In fact, at any moment, I guess, for the right player and the right price, that is the time to do it. These guys don't become available that much. But in general, I thought this was a good read from Zach, first of all, on ESPN. Check it out. But also the takeaways, I think, are really relevant to any team, but specifically for the Pacers, who have 6 years with Tyrese Halliburton now to figure out how to build around him and how to move into their next era. Really investigating what went well and poorly for the Blazers is something the Pacers could look into. When I was reading this, I thought, wow. I generally think a lot about what is the best time for a big trade. And the general answer is there isn't one. It's just when it's available to you. But when you really see it over an 8-year period, that all these small trades that seem good and get you good stuff and keep your asset pool strong, they don't amount to enough if that's all you do for a really long time. You have to, at one point, be bold and creative, and the Pacers will have to figure that out going forward into their next era. Highly recommend reading it. Zach Lowe in ESPN+. Good stuff on the Damian Lillard saga and what it means for the Blazers. Tomorrow, no show. Pacers don't actually play a Summer League game unless there's a big news or a trade or something. Then, of course, we'll hop in. So the next show is going to be Monday. Monday, we're talking Chris Duarte's 2 years with the Pacers, what went wrong and changed in year 2 to get us to this point. We'll talk about Summer League Game 5 against the Pistons and something else that I can't really say at the exact moment, and then Summer League recap after that, and then some more offseason topics. Lots of fun stuff coming as usual here on the Locked On Pacers podcast. Hope you guys are having a great weekend and enjoying the Summer League hoops. We will see you soon.